She was 18 years old and turned out of service without a shilling of the wages owed her, sent walking down the drive of Bracken Fold with a bundle under one arm and a key in her pocket. She had been ordered to surrender. No family living, no character reference, no place to sleep by nightfall. But what the housekeeper did not know, and what the steward who dismissed her would come bitterly to regret, was that the key she kept fit a timber door in the cellar passage that had not been opened in 19 years, and behind that door lay something that would settle every account against her. Stay close and settle in beside the fire and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Charlotte Hayes had come to Bracken Fold at the age of 14. In the spring of a year that took both of her parents within 4 months of one another. First her father to a lung fever that emptied him slowly across a winter, and then her mother to the exhaustion of nursing him and the grief that came after, so that by April, Charlotte was standing alone in the small stone cottage on the edge of Marlbrook village with a bailiff's man measuring the furniture. Her father had been a shoemaker of steady but modest trade. Her mother a laundress who took in fine linen for the vicarage and the 2 better houses of the parish, and between them they had raised one surviving child in careful cleanliness and plain speech, teaching her to read from the Bible and the parish register, to write a fair hand at the kitchen table, and to keep accounts of the shop takings in a small ledger that her father had bound himself from offcuts of calf leather. That ledger she kept still. It was the beloved thing she carried in her bundle, with her mother's tortoise-shell comb pressed between its final pages, the initials E.H. scratched inside the front board in her father's careful nail point, and the last 4 entries in her mother's hand, made in the week before she took to her bed, recording 3 shillings 6pence for a christening gown and 2 shillings for a mended surplice. Charlotte could not open that ledger without hearing them both, and she opened it often. And she read the entries the way another girl might have read verses of poetry. She had been placed at Bracken Fold through the good offices of the parish curate, who knew the housekeeper there, a woman named Mrs. Eliza Bramwell, aged 53, widowed of a gamekeeper and childless, sharp-eyed, small-handed, and a keeper of standards that had not softened in 30 years of service. Mrs. Bramwell had taken one look at Charlotte in the passage outside the servants' hall, asked her 3 questions about her mother's laundry work, and one about the ledger she saw sticking from her bundle, and set her to peeling potatoes without further ceremony. In the 4 years that followed, Mrs. Bramwell had taught Charlotte everything she knew, which was a great deal: how to lay a fire that would draw in a chimney damp with autumn, how to turn a mattress and beat a rug with the flat of the palm and not the knuckles, how to write out a week's household accounts in a ruled book with the tradesmen's names in the left column and the sums in shillings and pence in the right, how to press a linen collar so the seam lay flat, how to speak to a squire without lowering her eyes and without raising them either. She had taught her also the geography of the house, which rooms were used and which shut, which chimneys smoked, which windows would not shut against the east wind, and which keys on the great ring in the still-room cupboard opened which locks. There were 74 keys on that ring, and Charlotte, by her 17th year, knew 68 of them by feel in the dark. Bracken Fold itself was a house past its best, a long grey manor of local stone with a slate roof going soft at the north gable, a shuttered west wing that had been closed since the death of the old squire's brother in 1849, a walled kitchen garden run half to nettles, and a stable yard where 3 horses were kept where once there had been 11. The present squire, Mr. Ambrose Kettering, was a man of 51 who had inherited more debt than land and preferred not to know the particulars, and the running of the estate had passed, year by year, into the hands of his steward, Mr. Josiah Peake, a lean man of 40 with narrow spectacles and a leather satchel he kept always at his side. Mrs. Bramwell did not like Mr. Peake. She said so seldom, and only in the still room, and never in words that could be repeated. But Charlotte had learned to read the tightening at the corner of Mrs. Bramwell's mouth when his boot was heard in the passage, and she had learned to be quiet in his presence and to keep her ledger habits to herself. In the winter of Charlotte's 18th year, Mrs. Bramwell took a chill that settled in her chest and did not lift. She lay in her small room off the still room passage for 11 days, and Charlotte nursed her through 8 of them with beef tea and mustard plasters and the patience she had learned at her own mother's bedside 4 years earlier, and on the 9th morning Mrs. Bramwell called her close and pressed into her hand a small brass key, cold and thin and worn smooth at the bow, and said only, "The cellar door, West Passage. Nobody's asked for it in 19 years. Keep it by you." She died the following night, quietly, with Charlotte holding her wrist and counting the slow pulses until there were none. She was buried in the churchyard at Marlbrook on a Tuesday, in a plain elm coffin paid for by the parish, and Charlotte walked back to Brackenfold in the rain, with the brass key sewn into the hem of her apron, and her ledger buttoned inside her bodice against her ribs, and she did not weep until she was alone in the still room with the door shut, and even then she wept without sound, because Mrs. Bramwell had taught her that too. She was, at that hour, 18 years old, motherless twice over, in possession of 1 small ledger, 1 tortoiseshell comb, 1 brass key of unknown purpose, and 4 years of unpaid wages accrued at £7 per annum against the promise of an eventual settlement, which promise had been made by the squire and recorded, so far as she knew, only in the memory of the woman now lying under the yew tree in the parish churchyard. That was in January. By late February, the household at Brackenfold had begun to change shape without ceremony. Mrs. Bramwell's rooms were cleared and her things sent to a niece in Derbyshire whom Charlotte had never met, and the great key ring passed from the still room cupboard into the leather satchel of Mr. Josiah Peake, who now let himself in and out of every locked door in the house as if he had held them since childhood. A new housekeeper was spoken of, but did not come. In her absence, the running of the linen and the still room and the daily orders to the kitchen fell largely to Charlotte, who did the work as she had been taught, without asking for authority or thanks, and who kept her small ledger up in her attic room, and wrote down each week what she had done and what stores she had used, in the fair hand her mother had taught her. On the last Friday in February, in the mid-afternoon, Mr. Peake sent word by the boot-boy that Charlotte was wanted in the steward's room. She wiped her hands on her apron and went down the back stair and along the corridor to the room at the end of the passage that had once been a gun room and was now Mr. Peake's office, and she knocked once and waited to be called in. Mr. Peake was seated at the deal table with his satchel open beside him and a paper laid out in front of him and his spectacles pushed up onto the bridge of his nose. He did not stand. He did not offer her a chair. He said, without preamble, that the household was to be reduced, that the squire had authorized certain economies, and that her services were no longer required at Brackenfold. He said it in the flat, level voice of a man reading from a list. Charlotte stood with her hands folded in front of her apron and asked quietly about her wages. Mr. Peake looked down at his paper and said that upon a review of the estate books, there was no record of any promise of settlement, no entry of arrears, and no signed indenture in Charlotte's name, and that in the absence of such record, no sum could properly be paid. He said the parish had placed her, and the parish might place her again, and that Brackenfold owed her nothing but a plain character which he would not, in the circumstances, feel able to write. He then said, as if it were an afterthought, that any keys in her possession were to be surrendered before she left the house, and named specifically the small brass key from the west cellar passage, which he had been informed by the late housekeeper's inventory was still unaccounted for. Charlotte did not answer at once. She stood very still and looked at a point on the wall above Mr. Peake's shoulder, where a patch of damp had lifted the paper into a small brown blister, and she thought, in that measured way she had learned at deathbeds, about what she would say and what she would not say. Then she said, "Yes, sir," and nothing more. She went up to her attic, folded her second dress and her spare apron and her night shift into a square of brown holland cloth, tied it with the same length of tape she had used for 4 years, took down the ledger and the tortoiseshell comb, felt at the hem of her apron for the brass key, and did not take it out. She surrendered at the back door the 3 keys she carried openly on a ribbon at her waist, the still room, the linen press, the tea caddy, and Mr. Peake counted them into his palm without looking at her face. She left by the servant's door because the front had never been hers to use. It was a little after 4 o'clock, and the light had already begun to go gray over the beach avenue, and there was a fine cold rain falling that was not quite sleet, but had the taste of it. She carried her bundle under her left arm and felt the ledger settled inside her bodice against her ribs, as she had felt it on the day of Mrs. Bramwell's funeral, and she walked down the drive between the two lines of beech trees whose branches met overhead in a low gray arch, and she did not look back at the house. The gravel was pitted and puddled, and she felt the water come through the seam at the toe of her right boot before she had gone 100 yards. She did not stop to consider it. She had been in wet boots before. At the lodge gate, the keeper's wife, a small woman named Mrs. Trewin, who had known Mrs. Bramwell for 20 years, came to the door and looked at Charlotte and at her bundle and at the closing dusk, and said only, "You've been turned off." It was not a question. Charlotte nodded. Mrs. Trewin went inside without another word, and came back with a piece of yesterday's bread wrapped in a clean cloth and a hard end of cheese, and pressed them into Charlotte's free hand and said, "Marlbrook's 4 miles. Walk steady. Don't stop in the wet." Charlotte thanked her, and put the bread and cheese in her bundle, and went out under the arch of the lodge onto the lane. The lane from Bracken Fold to Marlbrook ran east along the shoulder of a low ridge, between hedgerows of hawthorn and blackthorn, stripped almost bare by the winter, and past 3 fields sown with winter wheat that stood in thin pale rows in the failing light. The rain thickened, and then thinned again. The wind was in the north and pushed at her right side, and she leaned into it a little as she walked. She counted her paces in sets of 100, as she had counted potato skins into the pail as a child, and when she had counted 12 sets, she allowed herself to stop under a thorn at the corner of a stile and eat half of Mrs. Trewin's bread and cheese, standing, because if she sat down on the wet stile, she was not sure she would rise again. She thought, as she walked, of what she had and what she did not have. She had 1 ledger, 1 comb, 1 brass key, 1 change of linen, a shilling and 3pence she had put by in the toe of her second boot, half a piece of bread, and no roof arranged for the night. She had no family in Marlbrook now. The cottage had been sold 4 years ago, and the money used up on her father's burial and her mother's illness. But she had the churchyard and the vicarage where her mother had washed the fine linen, and the curate who had placed her at Bracken Fold, and might, if he was still there, give her a corner of the parish schoolroom for a night. She thought, too, of the key at her hem, and of the door in the west cellar passage, and of the fact that Mr. Peake had named it aloud in his office, and she understood, walking in the rain, that whatever lay behind that door was something Mr. Peake wished to reach and had not yet reached, and that she now carried the only means of reaching it. The lane dipped into a hollow where a small brook ran under a stone bridge, and she stopped on the bridge and looked down at the black water moving fast between the stones, and she felt the cold rise up out of it into her boots and her skirt, and she went on. It was full dark when she came at last to the top of the rise above Marlbrook, and saw below her the scatter of yellow-lit windows and the square black tower of the parish church against the last gray of the sky, and she walked down toward them without hurry, because hurry was not what she had left with. The curate at Marlbrook was a Mr. Henry Ashwell, a thin man in his middle 50s who had buried both her parents and who remembered her at once by the way she stood at his door, quiet and rain-soaked, with her bundle held close under her arm. He asked no questions that first night. He fetched his housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Doreen Pyle, aged 61, who took Charlotte into the small back kitchen of the vicarage, sat her on a stool near the range, drew off her wet boots one at a time with the careful patience of a woman who had done such things before, and set them soles up on the fender. Mrs. Pyle gave her a mug of hot water with a spoonful of treacle in it, a piece of bread and dripping, a dry stocking off her own line, and made her a bed on the parish schoolroom floor with 2 horsehair cushions and a gray blanket that smelled faintly of camphor. Charlotte slept with the ledger inside her bodice and the brass key still sewn into the hem of her apron, and she woke before 6 with the sound of a magpie in the churchyard yew and the light coming gray at the schoolroom window. She sat up on the cushions and did not know, for the first moment, where she was, and then she knew, and she folded the blanket and set it on the schoolmaster's chair and put her boots back on and went out to find Mr. Ashwell. Mr. Ashwell was in his study with a cup of tea and the parish register open, and he asked her gently what she meant to do. Charlotte said that she believed she was owed £28 in wages by Brackenfold, that the promise had been made by Mr. Kettering to Mrs. Bramwell in her hearing when she was 16, and that she meant to have it. She did not mention the brass key. Mr. Ashwell looked at her a long while and said that a bare word from a dead housekeeper would not weigh against the estate books, and that Mr. Peake was known in the county to be careful with paper, and that if she pressed the matter without proof, she would be called a liar and turned away from every kitchen door within 20 miles. Charlotte said, "Yes, sir, I know." Mr. Ashwell then said that she could sleep in the schoolroom for a week, that Mrs. Pyle would find her small work, and that beyond that he could not answer. He wrote her, without being asked, a plain paper stating that she was known to him, that her parents had been respectable, and that she had served 4 years at Brackenfold in good standing so far as he had heard. He folded it and gave it to her, and Charlotte put it inside the ledger between the pages where her mother's last entries were written. For 3 days Charlotte worked in the vicarage. She scrubbed the flags of the back kitchen, blacked the range, mended a torn surplice at the vestry table with small, even stitches learned from her mother, and helped Mrs. Pyle boil sheets in the copper. She was fed twice a day and given a shilling on the 3rd evening. She kept the shilling in the ledger with the curate's paper. On the 4th day, which was a Tuesday, Charlotte put on her cloak in the grey dawn before the household was fully up, told Mrs. Pyle that she was going as far as the lodge gate and would be back by dark, and walked the 4 miles back along the lane to Brackenfold with the brass key sewn again in her hem and the rain thin and cold on her face. She did not go up the drive. She went round the north side of the park, over a stile she had known since her 2nd year, and down through the wet grass of the orchard toward the low back wall of the house where the coal chute opened into the cellar under a rusted iron flap that Mrs. Bramwell had shown her one afternoon in her 2nd summer and had said in her plain way, "That's another way in, if ever you need one." Charlotte had needed it now. The flap was heavy and stiff on its hinge, and the iron rasped when she lifted it, and she paused on her knees in the wet grass and listened, and heard nothing but a rook at the far end of the beech avenue and the drip of water from the eaves. She lowered herself feet first into the chute, held the flap with one hand as she slid, and let it down softly behind her onto its rest. She stood in the coal cellar in near darkness, with the smell of damp coal dust in her nose and her palms marked black from the chute. She waited until her eyes learned the dark, and then she moved by memory. 3 paces forward to the low, arched opening, left along the brick passage past the wine bins that had stood empty since 1849, right at the 2nd turning, and down 4 worn stone steps into the west cellar passage where the air was colder still and smelled of stone and old damp plaster. At the end of that passage stood the timber door. Charlotte had passed it 100 times in 4 years, and had never, on Mrs. Bramwell's quiet instruction, tried its lock. She took the small brass key from the hem of her apron, wiped her fingers on the inside of her cloak, and set the key into the plate. The plate was of black painted iron, square, with a keyhole worn shiny at its lower edge. The door itself was of dark oak boards, some 3 inches thick, with 3 iron straps across it and a small round handle of turned wood. It was 5 feet 10 inches high, so that a tall man would need to stoop, and 2 feet 6 inches wide, and it had settled a little on its hinges over 19 years, so that its lower edge scraped the flag beneath. Charlotte turned the key. It moved stiffly at first, and then it moved, and there was the small dry click of a bolt drawing back from its housing that she had never heard before and would remember afterward as the sound her life had turned upon. She pushed the door with the flat of her hand, and it opened inward 6 inches, and the smell that came out was of dust and old paper and a faint mineral cold, not foul, not bad, only very still, as if the air behind the door had been waiting to be let out. She pushed the door wider, stepped over the sunken threshold, and went in. The room beyond was a small stone-walled chamber, some 8 feet by 10, with a low barrel-vaulted ceiling of brick and a single arrow slit set high in the outer wall, through which a thin gray blade of daylight fell across the floor. Along the right-hand wall stood a plain oak chest, and above it a set of narrow shelves. On the shelves were bundles of paper tied with faded red tape. 4 leather-bound account books stood upright, and at the near end a small tin box with a hinged lid. On the chest lay a folded packet of letters bound with a black ribbon, and on top of the letters, weighted against the damp, sat a rounded river pebble the size of a hen's egg. Charlotte stood in the doorway and did not move for the space of 10 slow breaths, because she understood, before she had touched a single thing, that she was standing inside the arrangement of a person who had known exactly what she was leaving and for whom. She stepped forward, laid her hand on the topmost account book, and drew it down into the blade of gray light. She read for the better part of an hour by the arrow slit's gray blade, kneeling on the flag with the account book across her thighs and her cloak still wet at the shoulders, and what she found in it was not the estate's ordinary book, but a private ledger kept in a small, sloping, careful hand, and it recorded, quarter by quarter, tenant by tenant, the rents received from the Brackenfold tenants between 1849 and 1855, together with the sums entered into the estate's public books, and the difference between the two, which in most quarters ran to 12 or 15 pounds, and in one Michaelmas quarter of 1853 to 22 pounds and 8 shillings. Beside each entry a second hand, an older, firmer hand, had written a short remark in pencil, and one of these remarks said only, J. Peake, Jr., collected in person, no receipt given, and another said, Widow Coombs, paid full, entered short by 4 shillings. Charlotte turned the pages slowly and understood, with a clarity that made her set the book down on the chest for a moment and rest her hands flat on the oak, that Mr. Peake had been at this work not for 2 years, but for the better part of 20, that he had begun in his father's time and continued in his own, and that someone at Brackenfold had known and had kept a quiet parallel account and had died before finding the moment to lay it down. She opened the tin box next, and inside were sovereigns wrapped in twists of oiled paper, 42 of them counted by her own fingers there in the cold, together with a small canvas bag of half-sovereigns and shillings, and a folded paper on top written in the same older hand, addressed in 3 plain words, to whoever finds. She did not read that paper at once. She put it inside the ledger against her ribs, and she took the topmost account book, and the tin box and the packet of letters, and she wrapped them together in her cloak, and she closed the timber door behind her, and she locked it, and she went out by the coal chute the way she had come in, with her hands and knees blackened and her breath tight in her chest and the rain now heavier on her shoulders. She walked the 4 miles back to Marlbrook without stopping, and she reached the vicarage a little after 2 in the afternoon, and she went in at the back and put the bundle on the schoolroom floor and asked Mrs. Pyle for the loan of a clean apron and a bowl of hot water. Mr. Ashwell she went to at 3:30, with the parallel ledger in her hand and the folded paper still unread inside her own small ledger, and she laid the parallel ledger open on his desk beside his tea and said, Sir, this is at Brackenfold, and it is not mine, but it names what is owed and to whom, and I believe you should see it before I do anything further. Mr. Ashwell read for 20 minutes without speaking, then took off his spectacles, folded them, and said, Charlotte, this is a matter for a solicitor, and it is a matter for the magistrate, and you will need a man to sit beside you when you show it, or they will take it out of your hand. He wrote that afternoon to Mr. Robert Downes, a solicitor of Chapelgate in the neighboring market town, aged 47, a man Mr. Ashwell had known since school, and he sent the letter by the carrier's boy. Mr. Downes came out to Marlbrook on the Thursday in a black gig, sat 2 hours in the vicarage study with Charlotte and Mr. Ashwell and the parallel ledger and the packet of letters, and when he rose he said only, Miss Hayes, you have here enough to settle your wages 3 times over, and enough besides to unseat Mr. Peake from his office and possibly from his liberty. We will proceed carefully. He took copies of 9 pages in his own hand at the vicarage table, and he left the originals with Mr. Ashwell locked in the vestry safe, and he said he would write to Mr. Kettering that evening. Word of the gig at the vicarage went round Marlbrook by nightfall, as such things did, and the next morning a thin, straight-backed woman of about 60, called Mrs. Hester Loam, the parish sexton's widow and keeper of the schoolroom stove, arrived with a small covered dish of stewed mutton and said, "I knew your mother. Eat this while it's warm." She did not stay. On Saturday, a joiner from the far end of the village, Mr. Thomas Beale, aged 34, sent word by his apprentice that if Miss Hayes needed a chest with a proper lock, he had one part made in his shop and would finish it for 2 shillings and a Sunday dinner. And Charlotte accepted, and the chest was delivered on the Wednesday following, of plain elm, with iron corners and a good brass lock made by Chubb, 3 feet long and 18 inches deep, and she set it under the schoolroom window, and put the parallel ledger and the tin box and the packet of letters inside it, and turned the key. Mr. Downs wrote twice to Mr. Kettering at Brackenfold, and had no answer for 11 days, and then on the 12th day a reply came in Mr. Kettering's own hand, short and shaken, asking Mr. Downs to call at his earliest convenience, and to come alone. Mr. Downs did not go alone. He took Charlotte with him in the black gig on the following Monday morning, with Charlotte in her plain wool day dress, and her mother's tortoise-shell comb pinned into her hair beneath her bonnet, and the parallel ledger in a leather case on her knee, and the curate's paper folded inside the ledger where her mother's last entries were. At the door of Brackenfold, the same bootboy who had carried Mr. Peake's message to her 15 days earlier opened the door, saw who it was, and stepped back a full pace before he remembered to bow. Mr. Kettering received them in the small library. He was 51 and looked older than he had a fortnight before. Mr. Peake was not in the room. Mr. Downs laid the copies on the library table, page by page, and read aloud in a level voice the sums entered short in the estate books between 1849 and 1855, and named the tenants and named the differences, and said, "Sir, the originals are lodged in a safe place, and the matter will go before the magistrate on Friday, if it is not settled today between ourselves." Mr. Kettering sat with his hands flat on the table, and said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "Miss Hayes, what is owed to you?" Charlotte said, £28, sir, for 4 years at £7, and a plain character written in your hand. Mr. Kettering rang the bell and asked for his checkbook, and for Mr. Peake to be sent for, and Mr. Peake came in from the steward's office with his leather satchel and his spectacles pushed up onto his nose, and he saw the copies on the table and the parallel ledger open at the Michaelmas quarter of 1853, and he stopped in the doorway, and his hand tightened once on the strap of the satchel, and then he came forward and sat down without being asked. What was said between Mr. Downs and Mr. Peake in the next hour, Charlotte kept mostly to herself afterward, but at the end of it, Mr. Peake signed a paper in Mr. Downs's presence and Mr. Kettering's, and left the house that afternoon in a hired trap with 2 boxes, and did not return. Mr. Kettering wrote out a check for £28 payable to Miss Charlotte Hayes, and beneath it wrote a plain character in 7 lines stating that she had served 4 years at Brackenfold faithfully, honestly, and with the confidence of the late housekeeper, and he signed it, and he blotted it, and he stood up to give it to her, and Charlotte took it with both hands and said, "Thank you, sir." On the drive back to Marlbrook, Mr. Downs said, "There will be more to come out of this, Miss Hayes, for the tenants and the estate both, and I should like your help in the sorting of it, at a proper fee." Charlotte said, "Yes, sir, I should like that." By the end of that month, Charlotte Hayes was known in Marlbrook, and in 3 parishes beyond it, as the young woman who had turned Mr. Peake out of Brackenfold with an old ledger from a cellar, and she was known also, more quietly, as the young woman who kept a fair hand and could read an estate book, and Mr. Downs engaged her at 18 shillings a week to sit 3 days at his office in Chapelgate and copy the tenants' accounts back to their true figures, and to sit beside the widows and the small holders when they came in to be told what had been taken from them and what would now be returned. Charlotte took a small upper room over the shop of Mrs. Annie Whitcomb, a draper of 48, at the sign of the Blue Anchor in Chapelgate, at 4 shillings a week, including a coal fire on winter evenings and the use of a wash-house on Mondays, and she moved into it on the 1st of April with her elm chest, her ledger, her mother's comb, the curate's paper, the £28 cheque cashed into notes and coin at the county bank. and the folded paper from the tin box still unread against her ribs. Mrs. Whitcomb, on the second evening, brought up a length of gray merino she said had been sitting in the shop for 3 years and would suit Miss Hayes for a Sunday dress, and set the price at cost, and Charlotte accepted and paid her 4 shillings and 6pence, and cut the dress herself at the schoolroom table on the following Saturday under Mrs. Pyle's eye. In the same week, the tenants of Brackenfold began to come into Mr. Downes's office 1 and 2 at a time. Widow Coombs of Netherley, aged 69, in a black bonnet with a mended crown. Mr. John Reeve of Ash Hollow, aged 52, a small tenant of 11 acres. The Truans from the lodge come in on their own account for a quarter's shortage from 1852, and each of them sat opposite Charlotte at the deal desk under the window while she read out to them what the parallel ledger showed had been taken from them and what Mr. Kettering was now bound to repay, and each of them signed a receipt in Charlotte's book, and most of them, before they left, took her hand across the desk without saying anything, and Mrs. Truan, when it came to her, said only, "Bread and cheese, that night. Was it enough?" And Charlotte said, "It was enough, Mrs. Truan. It got me to Marlbrook." Mrs. Pyle at the vicarage set aside a place for Charlotte at the Sunday dinner table without discussion, and Charlotte walked in from Chapelgate every Saturday afternoon along the same lane she had walked in the dark that February evening, 4 miles each way, and she went to the churchyard first and stood 5 minutes at her father's stone, and 5 at her mother's, and 5 at Mrs. Bramwell's, which had a plain slate marker paid for now by Charlotte and cut by Mr. Beale the joiner at cost, reading Eliza Bramwell, housekeeper of Brackenfold, 1801, 1868, she kept the keys. In Chapelgate the shopkeepers came to know her by name within a month. Mr. Alfred Sturge the grocer, aged 57, who kept back a pound of good tea for her each Friday. Mrs. Whitcomb downstairs, who called up to say when the kettle was on. Mr. Downes's clerk, a young man of 20 called Edwin Marsh, who set out her chair and her ink-pot each morning before she arrived, and who asked her, in the 3rd week, whether she would consider looking over his sister's shop accounts of a Sunday for a shilling, and Charlotte said yes. She was not called Miss any longer by the boot boys and errand lads. She was called Miss Hayes, plainly, by grown men in black coats who stood up when she entered a room, and she found that she did not mind it, and did not, at 18, feel it as strange, because the work was work she knew, and the fair hand was her mother's hand, and the ledger on her knee at the desk was, in almost every particular, except its size and its binding, the same ledger her father had made her when she was 9. On a Saturday evening in late April, after her walk back from Marlbrook, Charlotte sat at the small deal table in her upper room over Mrs. Whitcomb's shop with a coal fire in the grate and a candle at her elbow, and she laid out on the scrubbed boards the 2 things she had carried against her ribs since February: her father's small ledger, bound in offcuts of calf leather with the initials E.H. scratched inside the front board, and the folded paper from the tin box in the west cellar chamber, still unread. She opened the ledger first and looked at her mother's last 4 entries: 3 shillings 6pence for a christening gown, 2 shillings for a mended surplice, and she set her mother's tortoiseshell comb beside them on the table. Then she unfolded the paper from the tin box. It was written in the same older, firmer hand that had made the pencil remarks in the parallel ledger, and it read, "I am Margaret Bramwell, sister to Eliza, housekeeper before her at Brackenfold from 1832 to 1849, and I have kept this account against the day it might be needed. 42 sovereigns are what I saved of my own wages in 17 years. I have no child living. Take what you find and use it as you see fit, and think kindly, if you can, of a woman who kept the keys before you. There is hope in a locked door if the right hand holds the key." Charlotte read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it between her mother's last entries in the ledger, beside her mother's comb, and beside the curate's paper, so that 4 things from 4 people who had loved her or wished her well lay together between the same 2 pages. She sat a long time at the table and did not weep, because she had not wept in company since her mother's burial, and did not intend to begin alone. She thought of Mrs. Bramwell pressing the cold thin key into her palm on the 9th morning and saying, "Nobody's asked for it in 19 years. Keep it by you." And she understood at last that Mrs. Bramwell had known what her sister had left, and had waited 4 years to be sure of the girl she was giving it to. Charlotte was 18. She had been turned off from Brackenfold in the rain in February with a bundle under her arm and a shilling and threepence in the toe of her boot, and she had been told to give up a key that no one had asked for in 19 years. She had kept the key. She had opened the door. Behind the door she had found 42 sovereigns, a parallel ledger that unseated a thief, a packet of letters, and a letter from a woman she had never met who had loved a stranger enough to save for her. She had £28 in the county bank, a plain character in the squire's own hand, 18 shillings a week at Mr. Downes's office, a room of her own over a draper's shop, a Sunday place at the vicarage table, and a slate in the churchyard cut at cost for the woman who had taught her the keys. Charlotte Hayes was 18 and had been dismissed without a shilling of wages owed, and she had been ordered to surrender a small brass key from the West Cellar Passage, and she had kept it. It was the best thing she had ever kept. If this story sat with you, stay a while and follow along and share it with someone who has been told to hand back what was rightfully theirs. And ask yourself, quietly, before you sleep, what small thing has been pressed into your hand by someone who saw you clearly, and are you carrying it still?